So as you noted, automated insulin delivery has had a pretty profound impact on the lives of people who lives with diabetes, especially people who use fast-acting insulin, who have to inject themselves several times a day. Basically, the way it has such an impact is that these systems are able to take decisions every few minutes, usually about every 5 minutes, on how much insulin somebody needs. And be that during the day when people are at work focusing on other things, or when they're sleeping. And so obviously with that kind of frequency of action, we are able to really have a profound impact on the glucose levels that these people experience. Now, it's far from perfect, right? Obviously we still have systems that need a lot of management, a lot of interactions, but it's really allowed a lot of people to get better glycemic control and even get better quality of life. And so there's been many clinical studies that have shown both these clinical outcomes and these more patient-reported outcomes, these quality of life, quality of sleep, capacity to work. I remember a family from one of the pediatric studies that we ran in France where the mother was able to return to work because the child was put on an automated system. And it was fairly profound, right, for that family. It really changed how the family worked, what lives they were able to have, just because the mother didn't have to be monitoring the child all the time, all day, and half of the night. Because of that freedom, she was able to return to her career. Well, there's a lot in that question, right? So the first thing we should say is that these medical devices are potentially dangerous and must be validated thoroughly. We are going to deploy these interventions in hundreds of thousands of people. And because of that, we need to acquire some certainty about how safe these devices are to use and how efficacious they are. And the only way to do that is through properly designed randomized controlled trial. We can show safety in some large non-randomized trials, but when it comes to understanding if we actually having a positive impact on the health of a large population, there is nothing to replace clinical trial. So that's probably the first thing to do. Now, I do understand that it can be incredibly frustrating to see how long it takes to validate these systems, because clinical trials with several hundred people take several years to execute. You need many of them. And so it can feel sometimes that the technology is blocked from patient, that technologies that are existing in academia and in university is not available to people when it should be. Very often these technologies are not available to people yet, not because of some grand nefarious plan, just because it hasn't been shown yet that they're safe and that you cannot make something available to hundreds of thousands of people before you have some notion of how safe it is. There are very active community that really try to advocate and push for faster translation. There's definitely things that could be done better in regulatory agencies or in the translation from research to commercialization. But ultimately, it will always take several years between an engineering development and clinical impact. So simulation environments exist in any control engineering research, right? Not just diabetes. And we actually, when we entered the field with my colleagues at UVA around 2006, there was no such platform to simulate the metabolism of glucose in human beings. And that was problematic for several reasons. The first one is, before one could go to human clinical trial, we needed to generate safety data, right, demonstrating that it was at least safe enough to be in the hospital in a clinical trial. And this preclinical data needed to involve animal studies, which are just as long as human clinical studies to execute. So our first impetus to introduce mathematical models and simulator in the field was really to bypass all these animal trials and shorten the time between an engineering idea and a clinical trial from what used to be 3 to 5 years to, in my lab now, it's about 3 to 6 months. So between a PhD student having an idea on the blackboard and the clinical trial, it's about 3 to 6 months. And that's because we can simulate the intervention in fairly accurate ways, thousands of times in just seconds. Right? Computer softwares go really, really fast. We can also do things that would not be reasonable to be done with human beings. So an example, when we first started in 2008 with the clinical studies, the FDA, the agency in the US that regulates clinical trials of these devices, was very worried about what would happen if the pump went crazy, if the pump started just injecting all the insulin without control. And how often should we check on the patient, because the continuous monitors we're using were not accurate yet. And so we did that in simulation. We were able to simulate the maximum delivery rate of that pump, right, emptying its reservoir into a simulated patient. And we demonstrated that nothing really serious was going to happen for about an hour. It would take more than an hour for anybody to really get into serious trouble. And so that basically told us, well, you should check the blood glucose of that person every hour. And so we can do things in simulators that cannot be reasonably done as well. And so we can validate safety in corner cases. That's a vast question, and I'm only partially competent to answer it, right? Because you're not just touching on research or engineering, you're touching on the organization of health systems at a societal level, right? Who gets what device at what cost? And so these are not really questions that I can answer, at least not intelligently. What I can say, though, is that at the research stage, at the academic stage, it beholds us to involve people of all source of life, if you want, from all socioeconomical status, from different cultures, early in our clinical trial, so that we at least design systems that are broad enough, that are generalizable enough, that truly anybody can benefit from them. There's a key example in automated insulin delivery. For the longest time, they were thought as, these systems are so complicated, we really should give them only to the most conscientious of our patients. And what we showed in clinical trial is that was silly, that actually the people who benefited the most from these systems are the people who were struggling with current technology, who were having a hard time achieving their glycemic goals. And so by involving these people who generally were excluded from clinical trial, by including them in our research, we were able to demonstrate the effect. And so a varied, diverse population in clinical trial is absolutely critical. And it's actually really difficult to get people involved in clinical trials from all walks of life. It can be very, very challenging.